More than 2,000 years ago, somewhere in the ancient Greek world, someone built a machine that could turn bronze gears into a mechanical model of the heavens. It could track the movements of the sun and moon. It could predict eclipses. It could display lunar phases. And it could calculate astronomical cycles with a complexity that would not look completely out of place in a much later mechanical tradition. The strange part is not that the machine existed. The strange part is that only one example has survived, and for centuries, nobody even understood what they were looking at. Today, that object is known as the Antikythera Mechanism, and the deeper scientists look inside it, the more extraordinary the ancient technology becomes. The story begins in 1900. Greek sponge divers were working near the island of Antikythera when a violent storm forced their ship to shelter nearby. When the weather cleared, divers descended into the Mediterranean. What they found was an ancient shipwreck resting roughly 40 to 60 meters below the surface. The wreck was probably a merchant ship that sank around the 1st century BC. Its cargo included marble statues, bronze sculptures, coins, glass objects, and luxury goods. But among all those spectacular artifacts was something much less impressive: a corroded lump of bronze. At first it looked like nothing more than a damaged fragment. It was transported to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. Then, in 1902, archaeologist and politician Spiridon Stais noticed something unusual. Inside the corroded material were gear teeth. A machine with gears had been sitting on the seabed for nearly 2,000 years. And that raised an extraordinary question. Why would an ancient Greek object contain a mechanism resembling a miniature astronomical calculator? Early researchers had only a few fragments to examine. The bronze had been heavily corroded. The wooden casing had disappeared. Many of the original gears were missing. So scientists could see pieces of the machine without understanding the complete system. For decades, interpretations remained uncertain. Then technology changed the investigation. In the early 2000s, researchers used advanced X-ray imaging and computed tomography to examine the surviving fragments from the inside. Suddenly, inscriptions and hidden gear structures became visible. What emerged was far more sophisticated than anyone had expected. The mechanism contained dozens of interlocking bronze gears. The gears were not simply spinning randomly, they were arranged into carefully calculated mechanical relationships. Turning one input could drive several different outputs. The machine was effectively performing mathematical calculations mechanically. At the center of the mystery was astronomy. The mechanism appears to have been designed to represent celestial cycles known to ancient Greek astronomers. The front displayed the sun and moon, while the surviving evidence indicates that it could represent the moon's phases. The back contained spiral scales representing long astronomical cycles. One of the most important was the Metonic cycle. 19 solar years are approximately equal to 235 lunar months. Ancient astronomers used this relationship to reconcile lunar and solar calendars. The mechanism encoded that relationship using gears. But the machine went even further. Another dial represented the Saros cycle, approximately 18 years long. This cycle is connected with the recurrence of eclipses. That means the mechanism was not simply showing the position of the moon, it was encoding relationships between astronomical cycles that could be used to anticipate eclipse events. And then researchers noticed something even more remarkable. The moon does not move across the sky at a perfectly constant apparent speed. Because its orbit is elliptical, its apparent angular velocity changes. The mechanism appears to reproduce this variation using an ingenious arrangement involving a pin and slot system. Instead of simply rotating a gear around a fixed center, the system created a changing motion. The result was a mechanical approximation of the moon's irregular motion. This is one reason the Antikythera mechanism is so important. It was not merely a collection of gears, it was an analog computer. Not a computer in the modern electronic sense. There were no transistors, no electricity, no software, but the underlying idea was surprisingly similar. A mathematical relationship was translated into a physical mechanism. Instead of asking a computer to calculate a cycle electronically, the ancient designer made bronze components perform the calculation mechanically. And someone had to understand the mathematics before the machine could exist. That raises another question. Where did this knowledge come from? The mechanism appears to combine Greek astronomical traditions with mathematical ideas that had developed partly from Babylonian astronomy. The ancient Babylonians had recorded celestial observations for centuries. Greek astronomers transformed many of these observations into mathematical models. The Antikythera mechanism appears to represent the meeting point of these traditions, but the identity of its maker remains unknown. We don't know the workshop. We don't know exactly where it was manufactured, and we don't know whether its designer was a famous mathematician or an otherwise forgotten specialist. The Roman statesman Cicero provides an important clue. Writing in the 1st century BC, he described mechanical devices associated with Archimedes that could reproduce celestial motions. He also described a device made by the Greek astronomer Posidonius that represented the movements of the heavens. These accounts suggest that the Antikythera mechanism may not have been an isolated miracle. There may have been an entire tradition of sophisticated astronomical instruments. If so, the surviving mechanism is not necessarily the beginning of the story. It could be one surviving branch of a technological tradition that once included many machines. And that may explain why the object seems so far ahead of what survives archaeologically. Complex machines made from bronze have one enormous weakness. They are easy to lose, they corrode, they break, they are melted down, their materials are reused. A stone temple can survive for thousands of years. A bronze machine can disappear almost completely. That means the archaeological record may be giving us a distorted picture. We see thousands of surviving stone monuments. We see relatively few complex machines. That doesn't necessarily mean ancient people built no machines. It may mean machines were simply much less likely to survive. The Antikythera mechanism gives us a rare glimpse into what ancient mechanical engineering could actually achieve, and the surviving fragments contain another extraordinary detail. The machine carried extensive inscriptions. These were not decorative texts. They appear to include instructions and explanations connected with the astronomical displays. In other words, the object may have been designed to be understood by someone who knew how to operate it. The inscriptions essentially turn part of the machine into a technical manual. Imagine discovering a 2,000-year-old mechanical device and finding its instruction panel still partly readable. That is exactly the kind of evidence that allows researchers to reconstruct how the machine worked. But there is still a major problem. We don't know exactly what the complete machine looked like. Only fragments survived. Researchers have reconstructed possible arrangements based on the surviving gears, inscriptions, and known ancient astronomical models. Several reconstruction projects have produced working models, and each reconstruction teaches researchers something new. One of the most influential research teams was the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, which included scientists and historians such as Tony Freeth and Michael Edmonds. Their work demonstrated just how much information could be extracted from an object that initially looked like a pile of corroded bronze. Researchers, including Alexander Jones, have also studied the mechanism and its astronomical context in detail. The result is changing how historians understand ancient technology. For a long time, popular history often presented technological progress as a straight line. Ancient people used simple tools. Then civilizations became more sophisticated. Then mechanical clocks appeared. Then modern machines. But the Antikythera mechanism breaks that simple picture. Because around the 2nd or 1st century BC, someone was already creating a compact machine capable of representing complex astronomical relationships through precision gearing. And then the tradition largely disappears from the surviving archaeological record. Mechanical astronomical devices continued to exist in later civilizations, but nothing comparable to the Antikythera mechanism has survived from the following centuries with the same combination of complexity and evidence. That doesn't mean the technology vanished completely. It means our evidence becomes extremely thin, and that distinction matters. The mystery isn't that ancient Greeks somehow possessed technology from the future. They didn't. They possessed mathematics, observational astronomy, skilled metalworking, and mechanical ingenuity. Those ingredients were enough to produce something extraordinary. The real surprise is how much sophistication can emerge when those ingredients are combined. The mechanism also changes how we should think about ancient science. Ancient scientific knowledge was not always theoretical. Sometimes it was physical. Someone didn't simply calculate an astronomical cycle on a tablet. They built it. They translated mathematics into bronze. They made an abstract relationship between the sun, moon, and calendar become something a person could turn with a hand. That is an extraordinary intellectual achievement. And perhaps the most fascinating part is that the machine was probably not intended to predict the future in a mystical sense. It was a scientific instrument. It represented cycles that ancient astronomers had observed and calculated. The mechanism was an expression of knowledge, not magic, not aliens, not technology brought from the future. Human beings built it. And that may actually be more astonishing, because somewhere more than 2,000 years ago, an unknown engineer looked at the sky and decided that its movements could be reproduced in metal. They designed gears, they calculated ratios, they cut teeth, they assembled the mechanism. And then they created a miniature universe that could fit inside a wooden box. The machine eventually ended up aboard a ship. The ship sank. The device disappeared beneath the Mediterranean. Its wooden casing decayed, its bronze components corroded, its gears fractured. For almost 2,000 years, nobody knew what it had been. Then divers found it. And more than a century later, scientists are still reconstructing its secrets. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of the Antikythera Mechanism. Civilizations don't simply lose buildings. They can lose ideas. A technique can disappear. A workshop can vanish. An entire technological tradition can become invisible because the machines themselves don't survive. And when archaeologists eventually uncover a single surviving example, it can look impossible simply because we forgot that such a thing was ever possible. The Antikythera Mechanism doesn't prove that ancient civilizations were more technologically advanced than us. It proves something more interesting. They were capable of astonishing technological sophistication in areas where we often assume they were primitive. And somewhere in the ancient Mediterranean, an unknown craftsman transformed the mathematics of the heavens into a machine. We know the machine existed. We know what many of its gears were doing. We can reconstruct much of its astronomical purpose, but we still don't know exactly who built it, where it was made, or how many similar machines once existed. And that leaves us with one final question. If this is the only surviving example, how many others disappeared before anyone could ever find them? Maybe the Antikythera Mechanism isn't the story of an ancient invention that appeared out of nowhere. Maybe it's the surviving fragment of a forgotten technological world? And perhaps the real mystery isn't how the ancient Greeks built one extraordinary machine. It's how many extraordinary machines we have already lost.